Welcome to the presentation of Group 5's findings from their marketing research project on contactless payments. Our marketing research question centers on a fictional chain of clothing stores by the name of Drip Rags. If that name sounds a little peculiar to you for a clothing store, you probably aren't in Drip Rag's target segment. Drip Rag targets trendy individuals in their late teens to late 20s. Like the word bad in the 1990s or the word sick in the earlier part of this decade, drip is a word among the aforementioned target segment that sounds negative but actually means the exact opposite. In fact, it means any look or style that is extremely fashionable or sexy. Our research question was prompted by Drip Rag's chief operating officer, who's become concerned about the fact that their stores do not accept Apple Pay, Google Pay, or other forms of contactless payments. She's concerned that their failure to accept these payment methods is tarnishing Drip Rag's hip modern image. That leads to our marketing research question. What is the value in terms of brand image and increased revenue among Drip Rag's target segment associated with offering Apple Pay, Google Pay, and contactless credit card payments? We performed a little secondary research and learned that payment processors who compete on price typically charge an effective rate that is somewhere around 2.5% of all transaction volume. Higher-end payment processors who provide more cutting-edge services typically charge an effective rate somewhere in the neighborhood of 3% for a difference of about 0.5%. We also learned that a thriving clothing store will bring in somewhere around $1 million per year in revenue, depending on the type of clothing and location of the store. That narrowed our research question to, is the value for Drip Rags in terms of brand image and increased revenue associated with offering Apple Pay, Google Pay, and contactless credit card payments greater than $5,000 per year per store? In other words, would the financial benefits of implementing contactless payments outweigh the costs? During our interview and observation activities, we met with consumers in the target segment as well as employees of similarly positioned clothing stores. During those interactions, we learned that contactless payments is not a delighter for this target segment. It's unexpected. However, we also learned that consumers wouldn't avoid a store simply because it didn't offer these payment methods. In fact, according to the individuals that we spoke with, the acceptance or rejection of these payment methods had little to no effect on their selection of clothing stores. We also learned that individuals in the target segment had either used Apple Pay or Google Pay or had a strong interest in doing so. However, most of them had never even heard of contactless credit cards. This caused us to eliminate contactless credit cards from our research question and focus entirely on mobile payment methods like Apple Pay and Google Pay. During our interview and observations, we learned 3 other pieces of information that would give us some important clues for answering our research question. First, we learned that most individuals who use Apple Pay and Google Pay do so as a backup payment method for when they've forgotten their wallet or purse. Second, we learned that certain segments of the population, especially parents of teenagers, use Apple Pay and Google Pay as a way to share their credit card with multiple family members without having to remember to transfer the physical card back and forth. Third, we learned, to no great surprise, that the actual use of Apple Pay and Google Pay tends to be higher among younger demographics.
Our first question was an introduction question, thanking respondents for taking the time to fill out this survey. Our second question, we asked respondents when was the last time you purchased clothing from a physical brick and mortar clothing store for yourself or someone else. This question identified our target audience and allowed us to separate shoppers by how often they shopped. We found that 78% of respondents had bought clothing in the last 3 months.
Question 3, which of the following traits are expected attributes of a hip modern clothing store? Here, we wanted to find out if mobile payment did factor into modernization of a store. With our survey, it ranked second among males and fourth among females. Furthermore, in what factors into a modern hip store, across any age range, creative displays was among the highest rated.
Question 4 asked, have you purchased clothing for yourself or someone else in the past 6 months that you would consider to be hip or modern? We found that only 63% of respondents fell into this category. The follow-up question, question 5 asked, was the purchase of these hip modern clothes made in a physical brick and mortar store? Of the 63% of respondents who had in fact purchased clothing in the last 6 months that they considered to be hip or modern, 77% of those purchases were made in a physical store. With this information, we were able to filter out respondents who did not answer yes to both of these questions to help us focus on our true target market.
This leaves us with the question, where's the money? We asked this with approximately, how much did you spend on hip and modern clothing for yourself and others in the last 12 months? Most respondents fell between $100 and $500. Of the contactless methods, the responses were all over the board.
Questions 7 and 8 were our experimental questions. We asked the exact same question for both 7 and 8, namely, how much does the checkout experience affect your decision to shop at a particular clothing store? The only thing that differed between the two questions was the image that we showed to the respondents below the question. 50% of the respondents were selected at random and shown a photo of a mobile payment beneath the question. The other 50% were shown an image of a friendly cashier and a pleasant checkout counter. The idea behind the experiment was to plant a mental seed in the respondents' minds, associating the words checkout experience with either mobile payment methods or a cashier and checkout counter. We performed a t-test on the results and discovered that there was a statistically significant difference in the average between the two groups. In fact, the p-value was 7.58 e to the negative 6th. In looking at the distribution of the two groups, we can see a steadily declining number of respondents associated with the mobile payments photo as we progress from very little impact to very large impact. However, when we look at the data associated with the cashier checkout counter photo, the data is much more evenly distributed, with a majority of respondents answering somewhere in the middle and just as many selecting very large impact as those who selected very little impact, implying that in general the impact of a cashier and checkout counter on a consumer's checkout experience is higher than that they typically associate with mobile payments. We performed our conjoint analysis in questions 9 through 17. The purpose of our conjoint analysis was an attempt to quantify the actual value or utility that consumers associate with mobile payment methods. However, it didn't make sense for us to use money as our ratio value because consumers wouldn't generally be willing to pay extra money in order to be able to pay in a certain manner. The concept is odd for them, even if that is what they would ultimately do by shopping at a more expensive store who offered such a method. So we needed to pick a different cost factor for our ratio variable and decided to use time required to reach the store, using 5-minute, 15-minute, and 25-minute travel time options. Our final conjoint questions presented respondents with store profiles consisting of different travel times, options for accepting or rejecting mobile payments, and short versus long checkout lines. We hope to be able to compare the utility consumers associated with short checkout lines to the utility they associated with being able to use mobile payment methods, to quantify to some degree how valuable they found Apple Pay and Google Pay when shopping at clothing stores. In looking at the parts worths for the line length attributes, we found exactly what we anticipated. The short line had a high degree of utility for respondents, with a maximum utility of 100 and 80% of respondents having a utility above 30 for this attribute. Whereas long lines had essentially zero utility, with a maximum value of 5, which could have been associated with the requirement to wiggle the slider somewhat in order to answer the question, and 99% of respondents having literally zero utility, which is no big surprise that people don't go looking for long lines in which to waste their time. However, we were surprised by the parts worths associated with accepting or rejecting mobile payments. The utility associated with accepting Apple Pay and Google Pay wasn't too surprising, with a maximum utility of 46 and less than 7% having utility above 30. We hypothesized that the utility associated with mobile payment methods would be less than that associated with short checkout lines. What was surprising, however, was the utility associated with not accepting mobile payment methods. Here again, the maximum utility was 46, and a startling 14% had utility values greater than 5. That meant that these respondents would actually go out of their way to select a clothing store specifically because it did not offer mobile payment methods. At first, we assumed that these respondents must have simply been blindly clicking through the survey. However, we realized that this wasn't the case because they all had the expected zero utility for long lines. Then we thought that perhaps these individuals must not be in the target segment, and that is why they were repelled by modern payment methods. However, we found a fairly equal distribution between those who were in and those who weren't in the target segment associated with these respondents. Then we wondered if our question was somehow confusing, but upon reviewing it, the profile seemed fairly clear and obvious. In the end, we were simply left with more questions to follow up on than any direct conclusions regarding the respondents who seemed to prefer stores that did not accept Apple Pay and Google Pay.
On question 18, we learned something about conducting surveys within this question. We accidentally made this a required question, but failed to provide options that would allow every respondent to answer to it. That meant that a respondent couldn't pass this question unless they selected at least one of the options, even if they had never heard of them. Unfortunately, we didn't do beta testing on our survey like we had planned to, so we didn't learn about this problem until after 100 people had already answered the survey. At this point, we made the question unrequired. However, even that may have been confusing because it was only a required question on the survey and it was near the end of it. So respondents may not have known that they could skip it even if they hadn't used any of the methods. It would have been better to simply include the options cash, check, and credit card, swipeable credit cards, that is. We believe that is why there's such a large number of respondents who answered that they had used contactless credit cards, despite the fact that we were never able to find a friend or family who resides in the US who actually own one of these credit cards. The next question is just simply gender. We wanted to know, in order to get some insight, we found that 83% of the people that took the survey were females. This really helped us when it came to finding out which gender used Apple Pay more and who used Venmo more. Lastly, we just wanted to know the age and residence of the participants because our preset restrictions to the research question were intended for people who lived inside the US and people between the ages of 18 to 27. We hardly had anyone participate in the survey who were outside the US. Only about 4% were outside the US. 38.73% of our respondents were within the age range of 18 to 27. We maybe would have liked that to be a little bit more, but we were happy with the results we got from the 40% that were in the age range.
To help us understand the results of the survey questions, we used cross tables, some of which have been shared already by James, Katie, and Tristan while they talked about each of the survey questions. In addition to those analyses, we also looked at how the age of respondents affects which payment method they use during checkout. We found that 91% of respondents use Venmo, but only 43% of respondents have used Apple Pay. 26% of respondents have used Google Pay, and 47% of respondents have used contactless credit card. We went one step further and looked at the age ranges and found that those under the age of 30 were more likely to have used Apple Pay than those over the age of 60, something we had expected to see. What we didn't expect to see was that respondents over the age of 60 were more likely to have used contactless credit cards than those of a younger age. This was a red flag for us and helped us understand the mistakes we made with this question, as Tristan talked about. Since our management question was focused on payment types, we also looked at how gender played a role in which payment options respondents used. We found that for females, Venmo was used by the majority of respondents, while for males, the percentage of respondents who used Venmo and Apple Pay were very similar. These are just two examples of cross tables that we used to help us understand the information we gathered in our survey and helped us form our conclusion.
Our conclusions in general is that beta testing is crucial. Had we properly performed beta testing of survey questions, it's likely that we would have caught our mistake in the question that forced nearly half of our respondents to answer or select answers that did not apply. That oversight compromised the validity of some of our data and made it difficult to draw more precise conclusions. Additionally, we speculated that some of the questionable results of the conjoint may have resulted from respondents not interpreting questions the way that they were intended. If beta testing had yielded similar results, we could have questioned beta respondents about their understanding of questions and revised them accordingly. We further speculate that some of the respondents may have rushed through questions without carefully reading them or selecting answers. And this resulted in some glaring inconsistency. If you've ever taken a survey before, you may have felt you were answering the same question 8 different ways. Those seemingly redundant questions have a purpose: answer verification. We believe adding some iteration to our questions would have yielded more discernible results, or in the least, better illuminated bad data. A common recommendation in our peer feedback was to expand our age demographic, and this proved to be rather useful. While the original target was 18 to 27 years of age, we did not filter out respondents outside of this range, and as a result, our respondent pool was nearly triple the size that it would have been otherwise. Research question conclusions were that the results of both our interviews and the survey were generally consistent in their support of the conclusion that paying for contactless payment services is not worth it for a boutique clothing store like Drip Rags. While many respondents generally have the expectation of contactless payment options, few actually prefer the same in this market segment. Additionally, the option for contactless pay or lack thereof has a much less significant impact on store image than other elements of the purchase experience. This conclusion may not hold for other industries. It is more common for consumers to utilize contactless options at convenience locations or where impulse buys might occur with more frequency. We would add a caution, however. Nothing in our research suggests that this data is static or timeless. Changing consumer shopping habits and higher adoption rates may very well shift consumer perceptions and utilization rates of contactless payment methods. Expectations of and preferences for such payment methods may be more positively correlated in the future, and it would be a good idea to revisit the research within 2 or 3 years.